What's up everyone? In this video I'm going to share with you my 6 steps to cinematic drone movement. One of the great things about using drones for video is that they let you move in any direction in 3-dimensional space and create dynamic movements, but if you don't know how to use drone movement properly, it can make your drone shots worse instead of improving them. So without further ado, let's get into it. Step number 1 is make your moves smooth. A lot of videos from beginner drone pilots have a lot of short, jerky movements, whereas for a professional looking cinematic video, you want to stay with one smooth shot for several seconds without any jerks or sudden changes. Now it's going to take some practice to be able to get smooth drone shots, especially for more complex moves where you're doing several things at once. It helps to have a firm hold on the controller and the joystick so you can move them precisely and hold them steady through the shot. Now some people like to hold the joystick with their thumb and index finger for more precise control, but I actually prefer to keep just my thumbs on the sticks so my index fingers are free to start and stop recording and precisely control the gimbal. Again, you won't be perfect at getting smooth shots at first, but as with anything, the more you practice, the smoother your shots will become. Now there are a couple settings that will make it easier to get smooth drone shots. First of all, there's the EXP setting, which slows down the drone's movement when the sticks are close to the center, but ramps it up as you go further away from the center so you can keep the same max speed. And this gives you more precise control over your movements, especially for yaw, or in other words, left-right rotation, where you need to be able to get slower movements for creating parallax, which we'll talk about more later in the lesson. In the DJI Fly app, this is under control and then advanced. The lower you set the numbers, the more it's going to reduce the drone's reaction when the sticks are close to the center. I have everything set to 0.3 for normal mode and everything except for the right stick controls on 0.3 for sport mode. And this is a good starting point, but you can experiment with it and customize it depending on how you want your drone to react. The other setting that helps to get smooth shots is the yaw and gimbal speed and smoothness setting, which in the DJI Fly app are under advanced gimbal settings. Now at least on DJI's Air 2 and Air 2S, I find the default settings to work pretty well in normal mode, but in sport mode, the rotation and gimbal settings are too fast and jumpy for getting smooth shots. The speed controls how fast the gimbal can move, and the smoothness controls how gradually it eases into and out of movements. So the settings I use for sport mode are pitch speed at 30 degrees a second and smoothness at 5, and yaw rotation speed at 50 degrees a second and smoothness at 7. Now this will make it so the drone doesn't turn as fast, but for cinematic video you don't just want to be spinning around at dizzying speeds. Step number 2 is use the right speed. DJI has split things up for us into 3 speed modes: Cine, or tripod on older drones, normal, and sport mode. Cine mode slows down your movements and is great for flying in tight spaces. Normal mode works well for the majority of drone shots, and sport mode unlocks the top speed of the drone, and it's great for getting where you need to go quickly and also for getting faster shots than normal mode allows. Now, how fast you want to fly is going to depend on the look you are going for. Slower moves give a more grand, epic feeling, more cinematic, whereas faster movement gives a more intense, fast-paced, action-type feeling to your video. Now it's not like one is necessarily the right way to do it or better than the other. I actually like both fast-paced and more slow cinematic drone videos. It just depends on the feeling you are trying to convey. Now the perceived speed of your drone shots is also going to be affected by how far from the ground or other objects you're flying. If you're close to the ground or flying through a small space, you could be flying in Cine mode and it could still feel like you're flying fast. Whereas if you're hundreds of feet above the ground, normal or even sport mode can look relatively slow. So keep that in mind and slow down your moves when you're close to the ground if you want to go for a slow cinematic look. Now when I'm further from the ground, say over a couple hundred feet, I like to switch over into sport mode so there's some significant movement even though I'm not close to anything. And flying fast at high altitude, even speeding up the shots in post, can make your footage look like it was shot with a helicopter instead of a drone, because helicopters are usually flying faster and not super close to the ground. Step number 3 is create parallax. To create parallax, you'll simply fly the drone in one direction while panning the camera in the opposite direction. And this creates a sense of depth because it causes different parts of the scene to move relative to each other. Again, this is something that will take practice to be able to do smoothly. You'll have to get a feel for how much you need to turn the drone versus how fast you are flying and how far away the subject is to keep everything from drifting out of the frame. Now you can just use spotlight or point of interest mode to automatically circle a certain point, But it's better to learn how to create parallax motion without automated modes because they're limited in what they can lock onto and you can't combine them with any other types of movement. You can also create vertical parallax by flying up or down and tilting the camera to keep things in the frame, and really any type of motion that makes different parts of the scene move relative to each other creates a parallax-like effect and helps to add depth. Step number 4 is fly close to things. As I mentioned earlier, flying close to things makes it look like you're flying faster than you actually are. And if you're going for a high-speed look, flying close to objects or between things or even through things goes a long ways to create that effect. And even if you aren't trying to get super fast motion, flying close to things gives a really dynamic feeling to your shot because you feel like you're moving through the scene rather than just viewing it from the outside. Another great way to use close proximity flying is to add an element of surprise by flying backwards past something, and as you move past it, it suddenly comes into the frame. Now, when you're flying close to things, you have to be constantly being careful not to crash your drone into anything. One thing that makes you a lot less likely to crash is to plan your flight path for the shot before you try to shoot it, so you know where the obstacles are and exactly where you need to fly the drone to avoid them. Step number 5 is use multiple axes of motion. I like to call this the 5-axis principle. With a drone, you have 5 different axes of motion that you can use, or in other words, 5 different ways that the drone can move. You can fly up and down, fly left and right, fly forwards and backwards, rotate or yaw the drone left and right, and tilt the gimbal up and down. And you can do any combination of these at the same time. The problem is, most people only ever use 1 or 2 of these at once. And shots with simple movements are great, but the more different axes of motion you can combine into one drone shot, the more dynamic and engaging that shot will be. For example, in this shot, rather than just flying forward into the scene, I'm flying forwards and to the left and panning to the right at the same time. Again, in this shot, instead of just tracking this car from behind, which would be one axis of motion, I'm flying forwards and sideways around the car and panning to the right and tilting the gimbal down to keep everything properly framed, which ends up being 4 axes of motion at the same time. Or in this shot, instead of just doing a parallax move around the castle by flying to the right while turning to the left, I've added 2 extra axes of motion by ascending while I orbit the castle and tilting the camera down to keep the castle in the frame. And as you can see, when you start combining these 5 axes of motion in different ways, there are almost endless possibilities of different drone moves and drone shots that you can get. Now, doing 3 or 4 or 5 things at the same time with the drone controller isn't easy. It takes practice to be able to think about everything all at once and pull off smooth shots, but after you've done it for a while, it gets to the point where you hardly have to think about it for a lot of shots. A good way to get started with using multiple axes of motion is to just add 1 extra movement to a simple shot. For example, you can push the left stick up to ascend while doing a parallax move. And then once you've gotten comfortable with that, you can keep adding more axes of motion into your shot. Using this 5-axis principle and combining multiple movements together will add a lot of value to your shots and give more of a feeling of depth and immersion and make your drone videos more dynamic and more engaging. And finally, our last step, step number 6, is use movement to tell a story. One great way to tell a story with drone shots is to use reveals. You can get this effect by flying over something, for example, a mountain ridge or a line of trees or even the roof of a building, and then that reveals what is behind it. You can also fly backwards, and then things are revealed as you fly past them and they come into the scene. When you're out shooting, rather than just randomly shooting a bunch of shots, think about how you can use movement to build or release tension, create suspense, or create a satisfied feeling like, this really feels complete and finished. In general, flying forward into the scene will tend to create tension and suspense. It's a great way to introduce a location or start a video. On the other hand, flying out of the scene tends to release tension and leave you feeling restful and satisfied, and works well for moving on from a location or ending a video. So those are my 6 steps to cinematic drone movement. Now it's your turn to get out there and start practicing and applying these steps to improve your drone moves. As with anything, you're not going to be perfect at this at first. Practice makes perfect. And as always, if you have any questions that I haven't answered in this lesson, feel free to let me know and I'll see you in the next lesson.